Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event hosted by Region 10 chapter of HFMA. Today's webinar is titled Partnership Efficiency, Best Practices for Working with Your Agency Partner. I would like to welcome today's guest presenters, Jerry Peer and Nicholas Prola. Jerry Peer is Senior Vice President of Operations for PFC. Jerry joined PFC in 2008, bringing a wide spectrum of collection experience in the retail, commercial, government, and medical collection sectors. Over his tenure, he implemented training that improved call quality scores to over 90%, translating into better collection results. He currently serves on the ACA Board of Directors. Nicholas Prola serves as Director of Compliance for PFC. A graduate of the University of Illinois and the University of San Diego School of Law, Nick joined PFC in 2013. His expertise is in customer protection statutes in the financial sector, including the FDCPA and TCPA, and state law collection compliance. Nick oversees PFC's PPMS and compliance program. So without further delay, I'll turn it over to our presenters, Jerry and Nicholas. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Christine. We're going to start first, and thank you for that introduction. We're going to start first with the roadmap of our presentation today. Very quickly, we'll go over the RFP process and ways to kick off the relationship on the right foot. We'll go into implementation, managing vendors, relationship management, and treating an agency and a provider as a partnership rather than just a commodity. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with risk mitigation. We will quickly go through the legal disclaimer that I'll allow each of you to read. But briefly, we're not your attorneys. We're not providing legal advice. As always, you should consult your own legal counsel if you have any questions, and you should not rely on any information in this presentation to make decisions or legal decisions. So without further ado, we'll get right into the RFP process. And it looks like, Jerry, your background is on the provider side prior to being on the agency side. Perhaps you can go into your experience with RFP processes, request for proposal processes, and where you've seen success and where you've had some hang-ups.
Very good. Nick, thanks very much. My experience with the RFP, to your point, yes, I spent about half of my career on the provider side of the equation. I served in various capacities, either as a business office manager or a director of patient access. And in dealing with, specifically in bad debt, the RFP, first of all, is the RFP process necessary? In my experience on the provider side of the equation, it was dependent upon the scope of the project. Typically, what we would see is when you get into the annual listings of millions of dollars, that might lend itself more to an RFP process. However, I think it's important to point out that due diligence, regardless of whether it's through an RFP or through just querying the various vendors that you're contemplating engaging in the bad debt collection process, due diligence is important in some capacity. From my experience on the RFP process, it ranges anywhere from a really good experience to an abject disaster. Those that I would typically indicate were into that abject disaster category was because the RFP, as when we started to get responses back, it was clear that it went through a procurement process, typically through a central office for procurement. And essentially, some of the requirements that we might be looking for were not necessarily articulated or asked. The appropriate questions weren't asked in the RFP. So I think it is important that, number one, that if you're going to do an RFP, that you tailor it and clearly define the objectives of what your RFP is looking to go, and engage all stakeholders. Stakeholders, and what I mean specifically there is certainly in your ops area, and then also in might be in your IT area. We know that if we're going to automate, I think the goal of any RFP is to automate as much of the process as possible, especially when you're talking about large volumes of electronic data interchanges. You want to make sure that your IT department is engaged from the get-go and that they understand the resources that it will take to get the project off and running. There are some other things that we have indicated up on the slide there. Pricing. My experience there on the collection agency side of the equation and on the provider side of the equation is it's just human nature when you get a response to an RFP or when you're looking at an RFP is to go to the back page and immediately look at what the cost of the program is without giving any thought to those things that are asked in the RFP process. That's fine. However, I think it's also important to consider that, that collection agencies, from my experience on the agency side of the equation, it's a margin business. And the lower the margins, the more pressure on the agency to produce quality results with limited resources. So I think that when I go into an RFP process, or those that were very successful, what we typically did is engage the vendor to try and come up with creative pricing, stimulate it through your questioning in the RFP process to look for creative pricing, and let them define that to you and articulate what that pricing might look like, and more importantly, how that might equate into higher liquidation. The goal should be higher liquidation.
Yeah, just to jump in there real quick, Jerry, one thing that we've seen on the agency side as well is, if it's not addressed in an RFP or in a specific question from a provider, what's the result when there's a very low bid for a very low rate, and the possibility that the provider and the agency aren't on the same page as to the effort they're going to get?
I think that's a great question, Nick, and I think that if you don't think you're getting what you're paying for, think again.
Right.
I think that's one of the things that you need to understand, as I indicated, is margins, and the agency is going to look for economies in trying to, and they would anyway, but I think that through automation and various other items, but for the most part, you get what you pay for. We don't think about this in terms of when we make any personal purchases, we look at quality and much as price. We want to get the most value for the least amount of cost. It should hold true in our business decisions as well. Our business analytics, let those drive some of those business decisions. So I think it has to be the right fit for both the facility and the vendor.
Right. You don't want to get into a relationship where, you think you're getting a full service, bidding at 10%, and then the collection agency is giving you really a 10% effort, which is not what you may get for a higher rate.
Correct.
So you want to make sure, if that's what you're looking for, that's fine. But you want to make sure that that's defined at the outset of the relationship.
Exactly, and I think some of the interesting thing, Nick, is that when sometimes when RFPs are crafted, one of the pain points from the provider side of things, at least from my experience, was always liquidation. We were looking to drive results up, and I think we had to introspectively look at those rates and see if we weren't encumbering the agency with lower rates. It may sound self-serving. I'm now talking from the collection agency side. But I can tell you from the provider side that it did make sense to look at creative pricing, and then truly and then of course in your vendor management, which I know you'll talk about later,
yep,
is making sure that what you think the agency is doing is what you're actually getting.
Absolutely. Just to build on that as well, if you're not doing an RFP and you're just asking for rates and you're doing a very high overview of what you're looking for, you might miss some of those value adds that agencies can work with you as a partner on. That if you're just requesting a rate and saying, oh, all things being considered equal, we're going to choose a lower rate. What are some of those value adds that you've seen that you can truly become a partnership with a provider?
Some of the value adds that I reference are training support, IT support, and what I mean by IT support is special project work that you might have a need for on a periodic basis that with some regularity you're going to need some assistance on. That is certainly one. The other one is educational support through webinars and other training items and then lastly, technology. Mm-hmm. Again, you want, as we already had talked about, what does one agency bring to the table in terms of technology, not only in their service, but also in their compliance piece that we all should be concerned about. What else? What other value adds are they bringing to the table in terms of the compliance? Do they have a higher or lower incidence of complaints than what you're looking for? So it has to be a good fit.
Perfect. And then, Jerry, as you mentioned, your background on the provider side, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on multiple agency partners and how that might have evolved with your experience.
Well, you led me right into that one, Nick. Multiple agency partners, my bias when I started with on the provider side was clearly that it made sense to have multiple agencies because competition was good, competition was necessary in order to keep one agency honest over the other. What I found through experience through a consultant who actually talked me into looking at a single provider, he indicated that, one of the problems that you have to look at is, do you get a significant lift from one agency to the other? And more importantly, what is the cost associated with that lift? So if I'm getting a 0.5% lift by having a competitive situation, does it justify the cost in managing two vendors versus one vendor? And could I get more for my buck in terms of volume by going ahead and shifting all of my volume to one agency partner versus multiple agency partners? And then lastly, I think that the other thing that you have to look at is, we perpetuate some of the issues ourselves, and that's from a provider side of things. One of the things that we were always concerned about was our public relations image on the provider side of the equation. So we wanted a low incidence, and we wanted them to collect the money, but we didn't want them to garner a pound of flesh at the cost of sacrificing our standing in the community. When agencies are competing with one another, the tendency is that they have to beat the other agency. Right. And not that you necessarily do it consciously, but subconsciously, the competition becomes the issue, and we maybe are not as concerned about patient relationship as we should be.
Perfect. Moving on to implementation. Now we've done our RFP, or we've done our due diligence. We've selected a vendor, an agency vendor. Jerry, why don't you give us some successful implementations and what those include, and maybe where you've run into some problems in implementation.
Very good. I think that, first of all, the implementation is a structured process. It absolutely needs that you need to give some forethought to it, even in your RFP process as you start to think through the project. One of the things that I've seen that would absolutely lend itself to is a project manager. We absolutely would endorse the idea that you should have and it doesn't necessarily need to be somebody who is a part of the project. It could be somebody who is just driving the project, right, who is holding people accountable to timelines, who's holding people accountable to tasks. That should be both on the provider side of the equation as well as the vendor side of the equation. I think that at the outset of the engagement, it's important that, dependent upon the size, again, scope, if it's a small project, clearly you would not necessarily maybe even need a project manager, but I think you do need a single point of contact on each side of the equation. Project management gets into actually driving to make sure that there's no scope creep, that if you want to have a go-live date of 6 weeks out, that there is a timeline that fits that 6 week that 6 week goal, and that you have weekly meetings with tasks and action items coming out of those meetings, attaching responsibility to a single individual. I think during the implementation process also, you do need to have a high-level discussion about what the objectives are. What are your expectations relative to liquidation? What are your expectations relative to automation? What are your expectations relative to reports? And what are your expectations relative to communication and ongoing treatment of your accounts? And then lastly, I think that, once those are all decided, the project goes forward, and then part of the implementation should also include a communication plan. That communication plan generally is going to be post-go live. Sometimes what I have found is, from an agency side and a provider side, one of the things that we often overlooked was including constituencies that we didn't think of. As an example, I did a training recently at a hospital, and one of the first questions I asked them is, were they familiar with the name PFC? None of them were familiar with the name PFC, and that's surprising to me. You're going to have patients who are going to come into the office, right, who are going to come into your facility, and either about a complaint or a dispute or some concerns, any number of different issues that they might have. And if the frontline folks don't know who you are, how can they effectively and intelligently communicate with that consumer? And nothing's worse.
Yeah, and that just really does make the issue worse when, you have a partnership with a provider and an agency. You get a patient who's complaining, and, the frontline person at the provider says, oh, I have no idea who this PFC is. It doesn't lead a lot of credibility for the agency and the provider themselves when they're trying to get their accounts collected. So, I can absolutely see how that could create even more problems.
Even operationally, Nick, sometimes some of the nuances of operations are, we are engaged on a periodic, obviously to report to the creditor, to litigate accounts on a periodic basis. If those things aren't communicated to the front line, you're going to have people walk through your doors because that's who they have the service from and that's who they go to when they have an issue or a problem in the collection of that matter. So if they're not aware of what the agencies, if your frontline folks are not aware of what the agency is doing relative to credit reporting, what the agency is doing relative to litigation, they're not going to be able to speak intelligently to that consumer. And your patient satisfaction surveys, as a result, are going to suffer. So all that great work that you do, your clinicians, your registration folks, all of that can be blown up in a heartbeat with when that last impression is not a good impression.
Absolutely. And one thing I do want to hammer home the importance of is the inclusion of IT in this process.
Absolutely.
It's all well and good to talk about all of these things you'd like to do in your implementation and how you would like the relationship to run. If IT isn't included in that, you're going to have issues getting that off the ground and launching that relationship. When we launch a new client at PFC, we always include IT, and we try to insist that our providers also include their IT department because they speak a different language. They have their own set of constraints. We might want to do something in a partnership, and IT says, this just isn't possible, or they might even have a better way of doing it. So I think, automating these things and creating an efficient relationship between the provider and the agency is best accomplished through getting IT involved at the outset, having them communicate, and kind of interpreting what we're saying into the IT language between those two entities.
Absolutely, Nick. And I think that one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that in today's day and age, especially on the facility side of the equation, they have multiple projects that they're balancing. And if you impose a deadline, artificially impose a deadline, which IT, through no fault of their own, can't possibly hit because of the other projects that they have in their queue that require. And again, remember, bad debt or agency relationships are a very small percentage of that total AR. So they may have competing projects and for resources.
Sure.
So if you don't engage IT at the outset of that project, you're going to have scope creep. You're going to have disconnects. Information is going to fall through the cracks. You really need that IT support on both sides of the desk in order to make the project go successfully, seamlessly, and smoothly. So Nick, we've talked a lot about you. I've done a lot of the talking so far. So I'd like to talk a little bit about your experience on the vendor management side of things. I know that there is. What are some of the? I know that you've dealt with. Done some audits and reviews. Internally here at PFC. You also were on the other side of the equation, looking at agencies from the outside looking in. What are some of the things that you would recommend in terms of holding that agency accountable to those things that they promised to deliver in an RFP?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Honestly, this vendor management, as far as provider-agency relationships go, is pretty new to healthcare. This is kind of old hat for financial firms, banks. They're under pressure from regulators all the time to have a strong vendor management program, and I haven't seen it as much in healthcare, although I think it's just as important, if not more important, to have that vendor management in place. We're talking about, providing agencies with large amounts of PHI, of HIPAA information that they need to keep confidential, that they need to treat and ensure isn't getting out in a way that can damage the provider and the patient themselves. So, I think pulling from the financial sector and really treating a vendor of a provider in that same way that a financial entity would is step number one. And that's going to include, and like we've said, all of this is kind of based on the scope of your project. If you're dealing with millions of records, millions of dollars, you're going to have a lot higher level of accountability than you are if you have, a few patient information that you're passing back and forth. But the first thing I would do is, the larger the operation, the more site visits you would want to do. You want to make sure that they're treating confidential information confidentially, I should say, you're going to want to make sure that they have clean desk policies in place that they're following, that information isn't just available to the public. The step below that are just routine audits, asking for phone calls, asking for remittances, asking for financial transaction reports to find out if all of the information that you're handing to your agency is being handled appropriately. And then finally, this is something that maybe you can talk a little bit about, Jerry, but operational calls on a consistent and scheduled basis are really important. You can go over issues. You can kind of head off any problems that you might be having in the relationship, or not delay in getting these issues out in front of. Can you talk a little bit about your operational calls that you perform with providers and how you found those to be effective?
The operational calls are part of that's an extension of the RFP and the post-go-live implementation process. After we've boarded a client and it's been through an implementation, Nick, the best success that we've had with operational calls is that we schedule them pretty vigorously and pretty frequently in the birthing stages of that relationship. So they may be as frequently as weekly after go live. It may be as infrequently as monthly, but certainly no later than that. And then once you get your feet underneath yourself, that things are running the way you expect them to run, that no issues are jumping to the forefront on an ongoing basis, then you can probably pare that back to monthly or quarterly or what have you, even semi-annually or annually. The operational calls I look at as a dialogue between the agency and the provider. Those things are absolutely intent upon going ahead and discuss. What we typically do is solicit clients for input of what they would like to see on the agenda on an ongoing basis. We also have agenda items, but just as important to that is the actual results.
Right.
Are we hitting those marks? Are we hitting the numbers that we expect to hit based on that RFP process? When we gave thought to what our liquidation, our expectations were, are we hitting those liquidation numbers at month 1, at month 2? And if we're not, why not? And I think that as long as we are open-minded, I think, and realistic about those results, I think that those operational calls serve as a very good form.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Just to touch on compliance very quickly, hopefully you did this in your RFP process or your due diligence before you chose a vendor. But things change so often in the compliance world, in the regulatory environment we're currently in. You're going to want to continually update your own policies and procedures as a provider and make sure that your vendors are all following kind of your expectations. Number one, TCPA is the greatest risk for, in my opinion, any business out there that contacts consumers or contacts anybody on a large scale. The fines, the statutory damages for violations of the TCPA are so astronomical that if you don't know what your vendor is doing to mitigate that risk, I think you're putting your own business at risk. There's vicarious liability concerns for the TCPA. Real quick, the TCPA is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and that makes it a violation of the law to contact a consumer on their cell phone without that consumer's prior express consent. Luckily now there are some tools to mitigate that risk of calling consumers, but you're going to want to make sure that your collection agency or anybody who's making any kind of communication on your own behalf is following the law and has those tools to mitigate that risk. And then, of course, the traditional concerns of the provider, HIPAA, that they're protecting patient information, that they're using the minimum necessary amount of information when they're collecting these accounts, and they're not. They have sufficient cyber security protections in place so that they're not at risk of getting all of this patient information out into the public sphere. FDCPA and FCRA are traditional collections concerns, really only aimed at collection agency activity. But again, we're talking about public relations. We're talking about a large number of lawsuits against your vendor is not going to look good for you, and it's not going to give you a good view from your patients. So, it's really important that you're continually staying up on these laws, or at least, subscribing to listservs where that kind of information can get out there, and making sure that your vendor is following the law and has policies and procedures in place to ensure they're treating consumers and patients correctly.
Nick, I had 2 questions for you. One is that in my experience, or more recently, there's been a trend towards remote access into provider systems. I'd like you to speak a little bit about whether or not that is, you would endorse that as something that would be, I know that when we do use it, we use it effectively in the on the dispute resolution side of the equation, but I'd like you to speak about any other associated risks with that. And then the other question I had is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I don't know if that's an acronym that the audience is familiar with, the CFPB. I know that in their charter, they really had no oversight as it relates to medical debt. But I do see a movement in that direction, at least by the previous director, Richard Cordray. I don't know that necessarily has been halted as a result of the new administration. But maybe you talk a little bit about why CFPB should be on the forefront of every provider side of the compliance concern and programs.
Sure. Thank you, Jerry. The first question you had was remote access. And absolutely, I feel that as long as it can be done in a way that is secure, and that's where you get the involvement of your IT departments, that absolutely, a collection agency vendor should have remote access to your system for patient information on a limited basis so that they can respond to disputes quickly, they can respond to complaints quickly. Otherwise, what you get is a lot of back and forth communications where the collection agency is requesting information, and maybe that's not a high priority for the provider, but it's a high priority for the collection agency. And it just creates a more efficient dynamic and a more efficient partnership if there's some limited access to that information. So yeah, I absolutely agree that it has to be done very carefully. It has to be done in a secure manner. It has to be done so that there's no instance of putting the provider's information at risk. And there are ways to do that. So getting your IT departments involved in creating that limited access is absolutely recommended. And then the CFPB, the reasons we all need to be concerned about the CFPB is, first of all, you mentioned that there's a new administration, but not much has changed yet. And there's still the problem that there's no real oversight for the CFPB. There's no congressional oversight, there's no budgeting oversight, and they've expressed an interest in creeping into oversight of medical debt collection. And we'll go over some statistics on that in a few slides. But what the CFPB has said that they're concerned with is that any collection agency or anybody involved in the collection of debts has three things. Management oversight, meaning there's a board overseeing the policy and procedures. There's not just employees doing whatever they want. There's written policies and procedures that you can point to and prove to the CFPB that you're following. And then there's also auditing to make sure that those policies and procedures are being followed. So you want to make sure at the very least all of your vendors who are engaged in communicating with consumers or collecting debts in any way are following those CFPB pillars, because even if technically the CFPB doesn't have oversight of medical collections, they're starting to creep into that arena, and we'll go over some of the ways that they're doing that in a little bit. But before we move on to some of that risk mitigation, can you, Jerry, talk about maybe performance reviews and how to manage a vendor's performance?
Typically, the way to manage a vendor's performance is going to be it's going to define itself simply because of those goals that you set forth at the very outset of the engagement about liquidation. And there might be some discussion about process. There might be some discussion of, obviously it'll all be flushed out in reports. But I think it's also important that you understand how confident are you in that the vendor is doing exactly what they're saying they're doing. This can be accomplished through site visits. I do recommend, we talked about that, dependent upon the scope of the project, and I realize that sometimes it takes an investment in time and energy and booking a plane ticket periodically, but if you're going to entrust millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars to an agency partner that you've never met before, I think it's important to go out and kick the tires. Mm-hmm. So I would recommend site visits preliminary to the award process in an RFP process, and then I think at least once annually afterwards. I think it's important, and that way you get a chance to not only to see some of the various reports on their site, but you also get a chance to get a flavor and a sense and a feel of how things work in the agency by we call the management by walking around. I think it could be reviewed by walking around, simply by walking through the offices and having the opportunity to see how they conduct themselves. to see how they're getting the other parties involved. I think that that's important.
One thing that's important to PFC is transparency. We want our clients to be able to see what we're doing, and we'd like them to be able to get that information, as quickly as they want. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how automation has helped us do that and how it creates efficiencies for that.
Some of the automation that we are actually in the process of doing is a client services portal to facilitate a dialogue, a one-stop shop, kind of a communication network, a little bit more passive in nature, but allows the clients to access information on the fly, whether it's reports, task lists that they may have, any number of different things that can go ahead and again, I think that reduces the amount of time. It allows them to self-manage the process. They are color-coded. So that's certainly one thing. I think that it's a two-way street. It's important that like you had mentioned earlier, that while it might not be important to them, it's a small portion of their total they are, fortunately, but it is important to those consumers that are impacted by this.
Sure.
And remember, for every single consumer that has a bad experience with a facility or a hospital, they talk to, on average, they'll relate a bad experience to 250 people. They'll generally tell about a good experience to 5 or 10. So you want to make sure that your dispute resolution process is solid, that you have a single point of contact, that there is transparency, and that the response time is reasonable. And what I would characterize by reasonable, we use a time scale here of, if we send out a response, we're looking for a response within 21 days. That way, we're generally underneath the timeline for most states when they impose a time limit for these types of responses of 30 days. So if we're getting a response within 21 days, that's reasonable. If it's taken more than that, not only is it impacting, remember, the patient, but it also is impacting, now you've got a regulator that may or may not become involved. And lastly, I think that, again, your patient satisfaction surveys are going to suffer as a result of those time delays. And then liquidation. When we do our ops calls, we actually tell our clients how many accounts are currently in a dispute or a restricted status, so that they're aware that this volume of dollars is there. All collection efforts have been suspended for reasons outside of our ability to control. And I think it's important that the provider understand that.
Right. And I think that's the those three things we just went over. Those are the hallmarks of a real partnership. We ourselves use vendors as well. There's nothing more frustrating than not being able to get an answer from your vendor in a timely manner because you have something important and it's not important to them. I think when you have these three things, confidence, transparency, and a response time and a commitment to response time, that really does lend to a partnership. The next kind of portion of this presentation will go into how to continually manage that relationship, how to make sure that you maintain that confidence and transparency and that response time. So here, under relationship management, if we can go to the next slide, the vital communications. What do we need to be pushing back and forth? From the agency side, I want to know, to push out when there's a high rate of disputes because, if I'm a provider, I want to know that all of my accounts that I placed with PFC on, or any agency on a certain date, if all of those are disputed, that tells me I have maybe something wrong with billing, maybe a data entry error, maybe a service, there was some issue with the services that were provided to that batch of consumers. Same thing with similar types of disputes. I'm going to want to know if, we always get a dispute that insurance wasn't billed, or I gave this information and I never got a notice. I'm going to want to know that as a provider so I can look into it and find out what's going on with my data, what's going on with my intake. Same thing with complaints and documentation mismatch. Those are things that can lead to liability. If someone's complaining and you get a large number of these complaints, you better look into what's going on. And if you're not having that continual communication with your agency, you're not going to be able to look into it. Same thing with, like I said, documentation mismatch is a huge one for me. If we have the wrong information for the wrong consumer and they're getting connected, that's an issue at the origination of that account. That could be an intake issue, and as a provider, I really want to know that.
So again, and it's from the provider side of the equation, conversely, Nick, some of those things that I would think that would be important to them are, and actually for both. Again, it's the arrows go both ways here.
Sure.
Complaints regarding services. You know, this is typically regarding this is quality of care. These generally go to quality of care issues. Hopefully, your agency is not ignoring those matters and is passing that information back to you. Whether it's a written dispute where it does call into question the quality of service or the quality of care. Those are something I would recommend from a provider side that are always referred to your risk management area to ensure that there's a full review of the medical record and that you're confident that those services that were provided are those services that you're billing for and they were appropriate given the level of care. The other thing is data errors and losses. I think that a provider is always going to be concerned about that, but also on the agency side. Data errors and losses is something that we're watching all the time. We do have again, when you're vetting your vendor, what type of processes do they have in place to mitigate the risk to the provider when there are data errors or losses? So, for example, do they acknowledge accounts? Do they give you a footing total that says that you got this many accounts for this dollar amount? And who's looking at that on the provider side of the equation to ensure that they're matching up? Same with if they're not, it could be something as simple as a decimal point being moved over on a dollar amount. That's certainly something that you should be concerned about. Changes in technology, transmission data. I can't tell you how often, you know, there are changes in systems. That's going to happen. But I think it's important that you have some type of change control in place that when you make a change, whether it's to an export on a file, whether it's on the provider side or the agency side, that we're communicating that to the IT resource on the other side of the desk to ensure that those things are not we're not importing corrupt data. Direct payments, I think it's important from what type of processes do we have in place on the provider side to identify those accounts that we show with an agency, and when we get payments on those, are they being reported timely? And then lastly, account documentation. Account documentation are all of your itemized statements, your consent for treatments, those things that you typically might need to support the actual evidence of the debt itself. Those are things that the agency is going to ask for on a periodic basis, and you want to make sure that the account documentation is in order.
Yeah, just to make sure we go over this in detail, I think one of the most important things for the agency and provider communication is almost these automated communications that occur daily upon placement of accounts or acknowledgments, payment files, all that good stuff. Because data integrity is the one thing that I think can get both the provider and the agency in real hot water very quickly. You want to make sure that in those data exchanges, the balances, the consumer communications, the disputes, you know, the documentation to support an account, all of those are getting over with integrity and get over accurately. If they don't, and you're not able to communicate about those things and discover when these issues arise, it leads to more and more issues down the road. It leads to HIPAA violations. It leads to FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act violations. It leads to complaints, and it leads to bad PR for both the agency and the provider. So, you know, managing that relationship, you know, in an IT environment to ensure that data gets over in the correct form, and that if there are exceptions or errors in that data, both parties are alerted to that and can investigate, is very, very important to me as somebody in charge of compliance for a company. And then again, you know, we talked about this before, but transparency and confidence in what's going on. You want to be responsive, whether you're on the provider side or the agency side. You want to have a good single point of contact that you can reach out, you know, with an urgent issue, get a response, get it elevated, and make sure you're able to respond to those things. You know, I know we talked about that before, but it's just really one of the things that makes a true partnership work very well, is having that connection and having that single point of contact.
Nick, in terms of the complaints that a provider might see from, relative to activities that an agency performs, what are some of the things that a provider should or could do once they receive a complaint from a consumer about activities, whether it's maybe treatment from a representative on the agency side? What are some of those things that you think are the best things that, what process should they have in place to ensure that the complaint there's no basis in the complaint, or that what would they need to do?
Well, the first thing is to reach out to the agency as soon as they receive that complaint. You're going to want the agency to put that account on hold. You're not going to want collection efforts to continue. You're not going to want calls to continue because you want to do an investigation into it. And hopefully, if you have an agency partner, they're going to be willing to give you all of the information on how the collections of that account went. Agencies should have call recordings if there were calls. They should have count notes. They should be able to tell you when letters were sent, all that good stuff, so that you can perform an investigation and find out if that complaint does have merit. So again, an open line of communication where you can get to somebody who has the ability to do those kind of things at each side, both the provider and the agency, and communicate about that complaint so that it doesn't get exacerbated and it doesn't get made worse. I think that's key. It's promptness in your responsiveness. Just as someone who deals fairly regularly with the CFPB, with the state's attorneys general, with the Better Business Bureau, the quicker you can respond to these complaints and get documentation to prove, that these complaints may be meritless, the better off you are. If you can, I would love responding to complaints the same day. If I get a complaint from the AG that says, the consumer's saying that this happened or the patient's saying this happened, and I can go back to the provider and say, well, I just need this documentation, and I can respond that same day, it shows that the regulators that I'm taking it seriously, that I'm on top of things, that I have those connections to the provider, and that's a great way to get those complaints to not go any further into spread.
Nick, if I have a call from an agency that is reaching out to me and says that they're dealing with a state AG complaint or they're dealing with a BBB complaint, should that immediately start off a whole host of alarms where I'm concerned, or is that something I just need to relax and trust that the agency has systems in place, or is that part of my due diligence when I'm investigating them in the RFP process?
Well, certainly, it depends on what the complaint is, but hopefully you have that relationship with the agency where you do have confidence. You should be requesting, their response to the complaint. You should be requesting their documentation on their response. If the complaint is something to do with a telephone call and you're the provider, you should feel very comfortable in asking that agency for that telephone call, and they should be willing to provide it. That's where the true partnership comes in. There's mutual trust on both sides, not meaning that you should just trust anything that they say, but trust that they'll give you the information to back up what they're saying. So no, it doesn't need to necessarily send off alarm bells, but it's something to track. It's something you're want to keep documentation on. It's something you're, as a vendor management tool, going to want to request all of the supporting documentation. So no, it doesn't necessarily need to set off alarm bells, but it should set off some process where you investigate it yourselves and find out whether the agency was doing what they're saying they were doing. Very good.
So we're well into the relationship now. We've got through the RFP, we've been through the implementation. We're conducting regular ops calls. We're doing reviews. We're doing audits. I think that the other piece of this whole equation is the risk mitigation aspects of things. And I'd like you to, I know that some of the things that used to be considered predominantly third-party problems have now bled into on the provider side of things. So maybe I'd like you to talk a little bit about how the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act may or may not be concerning to the provider, and then also certainly about the UDAP provisions under the CFPB. I think those are some things that are high-level things that we could talk about a little bit briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that is more recent. And we talked about the CFPB earlier, and this is kind of one way that they're creeping into regulation of medical debt collection and medical providers. Originally, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, and it still does, only applies to third-party debt collectors. So, if your debt collector does something that violates the FDCPA, the consumer or their attorney can't sue the medical provider. However, what the CFPB has begun to do is use the Unfair, Deceptive, or Abusive Acts and Practices, or UDAP provisions, to claim that a provider who's aware of an agency's continued violation of the law or willful ignorance of the policies and procedures of that agency can have liability under UDAP provisions. So it's kind of this wide sweeping, there's no real definition of what a UDAP violation is. It's anything that the CFPB thinks might be unfair, deceptive, abusive, or harmful to a consumer in any way. So you're going to want to watch out for FDCPA violations or potential FDCPA violations of your collection agency partner. And then, another thing that I think is really important, one way that you can prevent your agency, help prevent your agency from violating the FDCPA is passing them good information and auditing that information for them. Because the FDCPA says that a debt collector will not be liable for an error if it's based on information that the collection agency reasonably relied on from the original creditor. And that's the real important part there, is that reasonably relies. If you're constantly sending bad data, if you have errors in the transmission of data because of some IT issues, and those continually creep up, courts have more and more found that that is not reasonably relying on original creditor data, because you know that there's errors that could be possible. So it's really important to help your agency out, get good policies and procedures and protections for your transmission of data. Make sure your collection files and your payment files are up to date, and that can alleviate a lot of issues. Jerry, while we're on this subject, a lot of providers use secondary placements. Maybe you can talk about the effectivity of secondary placements and any compliance concerns that you might see from secondary placements.
Sure. Secondary placement is a common practice by many providers. Essentially, that means that you leave it with the primary agency first, and then at some predetermined time, you go ahead and recall those accounts and place them with a secondary agency. The alarming trend that I've seen recently is that there's more aggressive secondary placements. It used to be on average 2 years would be typical, and that makes perfect sense to me given HFMA's own data about how a collection agency performs and when they hit peak efficiency. That peak efficiency is attained generally at 8 months, 18 to 24. And I've had many providers. It's interesting. I've had many providers say, well, if you can't collect it in 6 months, why would you be able to collect it in 24? And that's a good question. It's a reasonable question. Sure. So the way I address that, Nick, is that I basically say that there are a lot of passive activities in debt collection that are effective and an integral part of the collection process. One of those is credit reporting. Credit reporting, because of the new Fair Credit Reporting Act and 501R, is limited. You can't take any extraordinary collection measures under 501R, and the FCRA new rules effective in January says that you can't even report medical debt until it's at least aged 6 months from date of last charge. If you're going ahead and pulling accounts back for secondary placement at month 6, month 9, or month 12, you are essentially compromising the effectiveness of those particular collection tools, and you're unnecessarily inflating your bad debt expense. So I think that that's one important consideration purely from a business standpoint, a business decision standpoint. Is it should you second place? That's a business decision. But I don't think it makes sense at any less than 18 to 20, any more than 18 to 24 months, or less than 18 to 24 months. Compliance risks. You remember that you're dealing with consumers. Consumers are going to, if a consumer is going to complain, they're going to generally complain within 30 to 60 days of the account being listed with the agency. We already talked about dispute resolution, and that takes some time to work itself out. If you're moving accounts more aggressively, the possibility of that account having an unresolved dispute has a higher likelihood, and you're going to frustrate that consumer, and again, that's going to reflect negatively in your patient satisfaction surveys. There's also the risk of some important information related to that dispute. It might include a ceased communication order. Sure. There has been some recent litigation around this that an agency sending accounts back to a provider who subsequently goes ahead and lists it secondarily and fails to communicate that matter is in dispute. There could be some litigation around that.
And then just look at it from the consumer's perspective too. They may have complained to the provider before it was even placed with collections. Then it gets placed with a collection agency, and they complain to that collection agency, and then it gets placed with another collection agency. It just seems like this endless cycle that they're just continually having to deal with a new entity, and they can never really get that complaint resolved. So it's just from a common sense perspective, especially on those disputed accounts, it seems very risky. And then, like you said, there's a whole lot of developments in when you have to report a dispute to a new entity, how that new secondary placement agency may be able to continue collecting it or not continue collecting it. It just creates a lot of compliance concerns from my end. I would prefer not you know this, Jerry. I would prefer not to take seconds as a compliance director, and I don't always get to make that decision. but it certainly makes my life more difficult when I'm concerned about what another agency did with an account prior to it coming over to our agency.
And I think that that's an important consideration. Those are some things that you, again, if you're doing an RFP, if you're doing due diligence on a secondary placement, you do need to take that into consideration.
And then just real quick, this is a snapshot of why the CFPB is so interested in medical debt and trying to have some oversight over medical debt. It's 2 times more likely to have a consumer dispute that the debt had already been paid, and that's because of the confusing nature of medical debt and the insurance confusion that can be created. It's also more likely to claim the consumer is more likely to claim that they were not given enough information to verify the debt, again because they can receive itemized statements that are confusing to them. They don't know what's owed. They don't know what should have been paid. And the consumer is also likely 2 times more likely to assert that the collector was collecting the wrong amount. Again, all of this just goes to the complexity of medical billing and the confusion that the consumer receives. And actually, it is less likely that the consumer is going to complain about the collection tactics used against them than it is the confusion surrounding the amount owed. So that really shows you that this is something that an agency partnership with a provider needs to take into account. Get some good documentation on what is owed on that debt, make sure they're only placing the amount that is actually owed, and then these things will be alleviated. Agreed. And then finally, I know we're tight on time, the CFPB is considering proposed rules for debt collection that actually apply to the first-party creditor. So that would be medical providers, healthcare providers would be subject to these rules. Now, like we've mentioned before, we do have a new administration that is overseeing the CFPB, so some of this might change, but this is something that the CFPB has been working on for a very long time. I don't think it's likely that this will go away forever, so I would expect there to be some first-party creditors rules for debt collection, mostly surrounding what kind of documentation is required to support a debt and how a debt can be proven up. So that's something to keep in mind. While in the past, debt collection has really been, handing it off to a third party and saying, oh, good, we don't have any responsibility or risk of litigation or regulatory oversight. That's quickly changing, and it's not far off.
Agreed.
So that wraps up our presentation. If there are any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. Do we have any questions right now?
Yeah, it looks like we had a couple funnels in here. So one of the, oh, sorry, Christine, did I cut you off?
Oh, no, go ahead.
So it looks like the first question is, how can you ensure that your vendor is doing what they say they're doing if you don't have the time or resources available to do those site visits you discussed?
Yeah, I think, like you said, if you don't have the resources, there are things other than site visits that you can do. You can prepond questionnaires. You can ask for documentation. There's various levels depending on your resources available that you can do, but you want to make sure you're doing something. Taking a handful of accounts, even if you're taking 5 accounts and you want to see the call notes and you want to see the call recordings and listen to those, if you want to see credit reporting, any of those things, even if you're doing it on a handful of accounts, is better than doing nothing. Requesting policies and procedures that are written from the collection agency, those are all things that you can do that don't take a ton of time. There's templates out there online for vendor due diligence questionnaires that you may want to take a look at. They may not be specifically to collection agencies, some of them might be, but there are some less time-intensive things to do other than site visits that I still think are worthwhile.
And I think that's a great point, Nick. I would think that there's a couple things that you'd want to do, and when you select those accounts, that it could be random, but I think it's important to get a good cross-section.
Sure.
Get those accounts that paid, those accounts that are in dispute.
Sure.
Ask your agency for your complaint data.
Yeah.
As on overall, and maybe you're specific to their accounts. These are things that are readily available from the agencies, and as you indicated, account notes. And call recordings are some things that they can look at, as well as some statistical data and benchmarks that they can measure to.
Okay, and it looks like the next question is, how do laws and regulations discussed affect other vendors not in the collection industry?
Great question. I think that the CFPB, and Nick, you're the attorney in the room. You got the ESQ after your name, so I'll defer to you. But I think that the one thing that the CFPB has made it very clear, and now again, remember the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was oversight on the financial products, but I think that the rules and the discussion that they have apply unilaterally across all vendors, and that is, remember that if you're entrusting your information that's PHI, that oversight of those vendors is going to be critically important. And Nick, I'll go ahead and defer to you on filling in between the blanks here.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And one thing that we ourselves do to manage our vendors is we categorize them. Obviously, your vendor that you purchase, the paper towels from is going to be very different from your vendor that you send to formulate your itemized statements that you bill consumers with, because anytime you're sending patient information, patient data, HIPAA information, that's a high-risk vendor. So what you're going to want to do is separate those vendors out from high risk to low risk, and then see what. Honestly, it is a rather involved process, but you're going to want to see what laws are implicated by use of that vendor. So if you're passing off PHI, HIPAA is going to be implicated, and you want to make sure that you have due diligence in assuring that whoever you're passing that data to has protections in place to prevent the spread of PHI to bad parties, to bad actors. That's one example, but you kind of want to do that for each of your vendors and say, what regulations or laws are implicated by use of this vendor. And then you can tailor your due diligence of that vendor based on those regulations that they're susceptible to.
And based upon the certifications that you would expect to see from that
vendor
vendor itself.
Yeah. So if you have a
payment processing,
exactly.
PSI, you would naturally want to look for PSI certification.
PCI, yeah. You would want to get payment card industry data certification if you're using a vendor for payments. If you have information on the internet, you want to make sure that they have the cybersecurity protections in place. Their SOC 2 or their SSA 16. So there's a wide variety, and it's a difficult question to answer because it's a tough task. But categorizing those vendors and finding out what risks are there can help drive your vendor due diligence program.
Conversely, I think it's important that, like you talked about the RFP process, that you tailor it to. So the certification issues, the certification should be specific to the industry type that you're looking at. You wouldn't want, for example, a PCI certification for the person that is providing you with paper towels. Right. That goes into the supercilious, and you don't want to get into that. Right. So be sure that the certifications fit the services that are being provided.
Okay, and it looks like the last question we have here is, how does your agency measure patient satisfaction when working with your client's patients?
So it sounds like how is PFC as a collection agency measuring patient satisfaction? We don't really measure patient satisfaction as much as we report instances of dissatisfaction to our client and get them to review that. Now, if you're asking, do we track complaints? Do we track disputes? Absolutely, we do that. Those aren't necessarily related to the patient satisfaction with the facility, but we do ensure that if there is a complaint submitted to us as a collection agency regarding the services provided by the medical provider, that is relayed upstream to the medical provider so that they're aware of it, and they can avoid any issues if they want to pull the account back, if they want to review it. We think it's very important to have that dialogue and that open line of communication regarding that complaint. And then as far as complaints for collections go, that's something we track very heavily. We have complaint tracking software. We have compliance software that we put all of these complaints in. We track them cradle to grave to make sure that an investigation is completed and that the complaint is resolved in some way. And we keep data on that and statistics on that we can report to our clients upon request.
All right, great. That looks like all the questions we have here.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, we can turn it back over to Christine now, and if there's anything you need to say.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jerry and Nicholas, for collaborating together for today's presentation. At this time, I'd like to thank all the attendees for joining, And we hope you can join us all on February 20th for the next webinar as well, so stay tuned for registration details. As you exit today's webinar, you will be automatically routed to a survey, and we would love for your feedback and direction for future topics. So thank you again to Jerry and Nicholas for taking the time to prepare and share your knowledge and insight with our audience today, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.